Let's start this section about functions with one of the easiest parts, which is default parameters. And a new section means new starter files. So as always, get yours from the GitHub repository and then open them up in your VS Code. So as always, we already start with strict mode here. But now let's talk about default parameters. So sometimes it's useful to have functions where some parameters are set by default. This way, we do not have to pass them in manually in case we don't want to change the default. Now in this section, we're going to continue with the airline theme that we started by the end of the last section. And so let's now create a very basic booking function. And we're going to do that starting with the knowledge that we already had previously. So without the default parameters first. So just a normal function. And into this function, we need to pass in the flight number, the number of passengers, and the price. And then let's simply use this data to create an object and push that into some bookings array. So booking. And now here we can use the enhanced object literal syntax that we learned about in the previous section. So we can now create an object with a flight num property without having to do this. Remember? So we simply define the variable here, and that will then create a property with this name and also the value that's in the variable. And then let's just log it to console. And then let's just create an array out here which will contain these bookings. So we start empty here, and then we simply push them each time there is a booking. So basically for the airline to keep the bookings in some kind of system. And this is all very fictional. It's just to show you the default parameters in this case. And speaking of that, based on what we learned in the last section about short-circuiting, how would we implement default parameters? Well, let's start by calling this function without specifying some parameters and see what we get then. So create booking, and now with just the flight number, let's say LH123. And now we need a new terminal as always. So again, I hit tab here to autocomplete the operation. And indeed, here is our browser with our page already running. Now here's some kind of problem. Oh, and that's because we called this booking here the same as the array. And so here it is then trying to push this object into itself, basically. So we need to create bookings here, giving it a new name. And so indeed, now we get here the result of this object. And now it works, and here we see the result of this booking object. And so what we wanted to see here was that the num passengers and the price are set to undefined because we didn't specify them. And so now we can use short-circuiting to our advantage because we know that these are falsy values. Okay? And what I'm doing here is basically the old way of setting default parameters, just to remember how it would work before ES6. So let's say I wanted to set the number of passengers to 1 by default. So basically we would reassign this parameter like this. So num passengers is num passengers or 1, which is the default value. And this works because of the reasons that we learned in the last section, which is that whenever this is a falsy value, which undefined is, then the result of the OR operator here will be this second operand. So this value here, in this case, 1. And now we can do the same thing with the price. Let's say 199 is the default price. And so if we reload this now, then indeed we get our default values here. Okay, so coming from this part of the code. However, this is a lot of ugly boilerplate code, and again, this is the ES5 way of doing it. So I will take this out. Let me actually write ES5 here, because now in ES6 there is a better way. So all we have to do is to write this equals 1. And so now this here will be the default value. And the same for the price. Let's say it to 199. And now if we reload, then we get the same result here. And this here, of course, looks a lot nicer and is a lot more intuitive to read. Now, of course, we can override these defaults. Otherwise, this wouldn't make much sense. So let's try H123. And now for 2 passengers and let's say 800. And now, of course, these values are the ones that we specified here instead of the default values. Now, one thing that's really cool about the default values is that they can contain any expression. For example, we could do times 1.2, for example, then we would get this here. Okay, but what's even more useful is that we can actually use the values of the other parameters that were set before it. So here we can now say that the price should be calculated based on a number of passengers. All right. So if we now do this, create booking again, just some random flight number here. Let's say again 2, but then with 5, we will get another value. So indeed, you see 398. So the number continues down here, and then 995. And so the price is now dynamically calculated by default based on this value we specified and the number of passengers. And again, this only works for parameters that are defined in the list before this one. So this would not work because JavaScript basically specifies these parameters in orders, and as it reaches, so right now, as it reaches the price, it doesn't know about the number of passengers yet. And so that wouldn't work. Now, another thing that's important to note here is that we cannot skip arguments here when we call the function. So for example, let's say we wanted to leave the number of passengers as the default value, but then specify the price. So we cannot do this. So skipping the number of passengers now, and then only specifying a new price. So if we do this, then of course, the number of passengers becomes 1,000. Because the second argument here will always be mapped to the second parameter. So if we wanted to leave this one here at a default, there is a nice trick. So the number of passengers we can simply set to undefined. All right, and this works again because setting the parameter to undefined is the same thing as not even setting it. Remember, so when we don't set a parameter, so when we don't pass an argument into that parameter, then it will take the value of undefined. And so specifying undefined here is exactly the same. And so this is how we basically skip a default parameter that we want to leave at its default. And so now as I reload it here, you see that the number of passenger is still 1, and indeed the price is now 1,000. Okay, so yet another very nice addition to the language in ES6 here, and pretty straightforward to understand too. So see you in the next video.